this camera. Yeah, and tonight we're starting a new theme: compassion for a modern world. So I'm going to be talking about the Bodhisattva ideal. So I want to talk about the Bodhisattva ideal, the compassionate ideal of Buddhism. And I want to talk about what it is and why it's so important to the world today. Why it's so important to bring compassion into the world, or what it's got to sort of, in particular, to offer that very, very important enterprise of bringing more compassion to bear on the world. So yeah, I'm just waiting to see if we're all here. I've got a screen in front of me. It looks like there's still a few arriving, but we'll need to move on, I think. Yes, so the Bodhisattva ideal. So you may or may not have heard of the Bodhisattva ideal, or the word Bodhisattva. So Bodhi, you may well have heard the word Bodhi, meaning enlightenment or awakening, and then Sattva meaning being. So the Bodhisattva is the being bent on awakening, intent upon awakening, the Bodhisattva. But really what the Bodhisattva ideal articulates is the compassionate ideal of Buddhism. And it emerged a few hundred years, I believe, roughly speaking, after the Buddha's life. So you might start thinking, oh, well, you know, is that a different version of Buddhism? And it certainly has been talked about historically within Buddhism as a sort of new ideal. In a certain way it is, but really it's an inherent element of Buddhism. You can't take the Bodhisattva ideal out of Buddhism. It's merely that it was expressed, and there was a need to express it in the years after the Buddha. Sangha very helpfully points out that in a way, something that was implicit had been lost. So it was needed to make it explicit in order for Buddhism to kind of continue to then flourish. So this is where the Bodhisattva ideal comes from. And as I say, the main point I wanted to say is that it's inherent within Buddhism. So if you're interested in Buddhism, you're interested in the Bodhisattva ideal kind of implicitly, whether you like that articulation of compassion within Buddhism or not. It's sort of you're implicitly sort of interested in it if you're interested in Buddhism. So one way Sangha has talked about this is that the Bodhisattva ideal it expresses the altruistic dimension of the Buddhist life. So it's an intrinsic element, a particular dimension, the altruistic dimension of the Buddhist life. And to underline the fact that it's inherent in Buddhism, he talks of it. He says, when you encounter the Bodhisattva ideal in Buddhism, you're placing your hand on the beating heart of Buddhism itself. So we're really sort of touching something very, very close to the heart of Buddhism in Sangha view. And I'm going to draw on Sangha perspective, well, because that's where my perspective on it comes from. But not just that, also because I think he's a quite brilliant sort of exponent of the Bodhisattva ideal. So one thing you may have heard with the Bodhisattva ideal is the kind of myth, the great myth of the Bodhisattva ideal of the Bodhisattva kind of careering towards enlightenment under his spiritual efforts. And before he reaches enlightenment, he kind of turns back out of compassion for all sentient beings. He kind of puts on hold his own enlightenment, his own salvation, in order to save other beings. So out of this, the Bodhisattva vow not to gain enlightenment before the Bodhisattva has saved all living beings. And Sangha points out that whilst this is this myth is very much of value in and of itself, it can't be taken literally. If you point out that it sort of implies the Bodhisattva kind of putting on hold his own spiritual practice to help others do it. Well, that would, in a certain way, be a sort of hypocrisy, wouldn't it? So we can't take it literally. Yeah, but one of the things that I think really helps sort of unlock what the Bodhisattva ideal is getting to. I read Bhante Sangha talking about the kind of universal nature of the vow, the Bodhisattva vow. The universal nature of the Bodhisattva ideal is a really important element to it. It crops up all over the Bodhisattva ideal, these kind of universal vows. And what he says very helpfully is that the universal nature of the vow is all about transcendence of limitation. So I found I find this really sort of helpful, really elucidates what the Bodhisattva ideal is about. So I'm going to talk a bit about that in order to elucidate what the Bodhisattva ideal is and why it's so important for us in the modern world. So to paraphrase a quote from Sangha Rakshita's seminar, actually, on the Bodhisattva ideal, on the Shantideva's Bodhicharya Avatara. I'll mention that again later, but a particular text. He says what the Bodhisattva is doing is he's kind of rather than sort of putting on hold his own spiritual life, he is developing an attitude, taking up an attitude that how to put it. So he says an attitude within which self and other are meaningless, or to put it another way, that they become indistinguishable. And by this he means they're not sort of indistinguishable in the sense that that self and other are sort of the same thing. He says that they're indistinguishable from the point of view of them being dialectically related. So when we think in terms of doing good to ourselves, we also do good to others. When we think in terms of doing good to others, we also end up doing good to ourselves. In this way, passing from one to the other. And he says this sort of suggests a state beyond self and other, which is where the Bodhisattva sort of resides, as it were. So that might sound a little bit sort of complex, this thing kind of dialectically related, but in a way it's a very simple idea, a very clear idea, that if you're aiming to sort of really benefit yourself and you think exclusively in terms of self, well, that's not going to help. You need to refer to others. And similarly, if you're aiming to really benefit other people and you neglect to refer to helping yourself, then you'll limit the ability to the extent to which you'll be able to help other people. Hello there, can you hear me all right?
Yes, yeah, we can. Yeah.
Logical difficulties, but don't worry, I'm back on a different screen. Kamanaga's going to try and take us forward. Anyway, yeah, so I was talking about the Aboriginal activist. I don't know if you've come across her, Leela Watson, who says, she says, if you've come here to help us, wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with ours, then we can work together. So that comes out of her experience of working as an activist in the Aboriginal community. Has the phone failed? Yeah, okay, so we're on this screen now. Yeah, she's saying that actually, if you're just here to help us, it's not going to help. It's not enough. Your liberation needs to be kind of bound up with ours. You need to be kind of growing yourself, and then we can kind of grow together. So rather than this being a sort of metaphysical point, it's actually eminently practical. You're not really going to help people very much beyond a certain point. Obviously, people do need kind of practical help, but really people, the root of suffering in the last analysis is in mind. So if you're not helping other people work with their minds, or sorry, if you're not working on your own mind, you can't help other people work on their minds. Yep. So it's saying the Bodhisattva sort of articulates this very clearly, that you need to take an attitude beyond a mere, I'm going to help myself now, or I'm going to help others. It's sort of, it refuses to settle down into those two key limiting narratives that we sort of see and live our lives through. So that's one of the limitations that we tend to kind of fall into. Another limitation that we fall into is the whole sort of story of good and evil. So very interestingly, Shantideva, I mentioned him before, who is one of the key exponents of the Bodhisattva ideal, living back in the sort of 8th century or something like that. He writes this extraordinary text, very, very beautiful text, very long text, very, very subtle text and very challenging text. And he says at the start of that, he says, this line, which I'm just going to quote, he says, the power of good is always weak, whilst the power of evil is vast and terrible. What other good could conquer that, were it not for the awakening mind? So the awakening mind is the mind of the Bodhisattva, a fully sort of, what would you say, initiated Bodhisattva, the real Bodhisattva. But the mind, the awakening mind, has arisen in the Bodhisattva. So this is really interesting, isn't it? It's a bit, I remember the first time I came across this, a bit sort of alarmed by it. It sounds a bit sort of medieval or something. The power of good is always weak, while the power of evil is vast and terrible. But I don't think it is medieval. I think it's Buddhism's very, very clear-sighted look at human nature. So I was thinking, just a few days ago, actually, I was watching the Extinction Rebellion documentary. I've watched it a couple of times, actually, slightly more than a couple of times. Very, very uplifting. These young people giving up their jobs, you know, a key time in their life, devoting themselves to this kind of this cause to save the planet. Very, very uplifting, kind of moving documentary. I don't know if you've seen it on iPlayer. It's still on iPlayer. At the same time, there's this one moment in the documentary where one of the leaders is leading a meeting, and he draws this kind of square around central London, And he says, and this is where all the rich, I won't repeat the next word because it's expletive, live. This is where all the rich live. And so isn't that human nature? So they're explicitly espousing kind of ideals of or a cause of love and non-violence, but in the very documentary, expressing hatred for the rich. This is kind of what's being got at here, that we finally get round to doing something good, yeah, to putting aside yourself, your life. Kind of wonderful thing, isn't it? I feel a lot of sort of support in a way for Extinction Rebellion, but I also think Buddhism has something very valuable to contribute to its narrative. So yeah, you finally get round to doing something good. And there you sort of espouse the ideals of love and non-violence. And there you are, not just sort of expressing animosity for the rich, but actually sort of inciting other people to it in a meeting, leaders of the cause. So, and I want to avoid kind of pointing the finger here, because I don't think. Well, I think that is, well, I'll come back to that, perhaps, kind of pointing the finger. It's a very, very easy tendency, isn't it? But this is a matter of the power of good always being weak and the power of evil being vast and terrible. Our sort of best intentions get sort of infected, get kind of taken over by our less good intentions. And I know this for myself. You know, here I am working for the Buddhist Center, a wonderful thing to be able to do. I've been seeing more recently, sort of below the level of consciousness, there's this kind of preoccupation with how I'm being seen. It's just sort of come into focus a bit more fully. In a way, it can seem rather innocent, rather innocuous. But actually, subtly, it infects the work I do, you know, in sort of small or larger ways. And this is the reality of human nature. So this is Shantideva's point, that we need to see human nature in a clear-sighted kind of way, to realize we need something beyond what we normally think of as good and evil. We need something, recourse to something kind of much, much deeper in mind. Than merely our current sort of good intentions or even wicked intentions. Yeah, what other good could conquer that were it not for the awakening mind? So I get what this is getting at is we need, in a way, to be able to see our limitation, our limitedness, our limited sort of where we fall down. We need we need a sense of something beyond the limits of self, so that we can look back from that, we can stand in that and kind of recognize our limitation as limitation. Really, really challenging thing to do, isn't it? To see our own limitations. You know, with the best intentions, we've kind of we've put ourselves forward to act as well as we can. But it's infected with our limitations. Very, very difficult to kind of see that, because we're sort of standing in it. So we need a kind of tangible sense of something beyond that, something beyond the limits of self, so that we can look back at our small and sometimes not so small, but small limitations, comparatively small compared to the awakening mind. So that's what the awakening mind is. That's what the Bodhisattva is. It's this much, much bigger, deeper aspect of the mind. And we need to have a kind of tangible sense of that. The work of bringing compassion to bear in the world sort of needs recourse to that much, much bigger perspective. And of course, you need to, as I say, have a tangible sense in it. We need to have confidence in that. in order to sort of stand in it. That's something, I mean, just actually a couple of days ago in my meditation kind of allows me to draw on that, allows me to get closer to that mind. As I was sitting in meditation, I could feel, as it were, the wind of something beyond me, a sort of breeze. Wind is too strong for me, but a breeze of something blowing from beyond self. And it's those experiences that give me confidence that there is something beyond self. And when I'm confident in that, it's much, much easier to see my limitations, to acknowledge my limitations. And that is what the work of compassion desperately needs. Otherwise, those little things that infect our good causes, our good works, will be expressed. They will send us awry and disrupt the work of compassion. So we need recourse to a deeper confidence in something beyond self. Yep. But I've been seeing in my meditation, the more I get to see self, it's like getting to know the island of self. The more clearly I can stand on the shoreline and feel the breeze of something beyond self, blowing from I know not where, blowing from abroad from self. And it gives me more and more confidence that I can kind of look back at all my sort of petty limitations and weed them out. Anyway, we need to be able to sort of see our limitations in order to be able to transcend them. And we need the Bodhisattva ideal in order to be able to do that. Otherwise, we're just standing in self. So, so this is kind of incredibly sort of lofty sort of aim, isn't it? But I hope I've, in saying what I've said, sort of managed to articulate why we need it. We need lofty ideals. We need recourse to something much, much deeper and more lofty. This whole point is sort of illustrating this point that about transcendence of the limitation. We need to be able to see our limitations to move beyond it. And the whole discourse of kind of universal vows, the whole discourse of kind of taking on the vow to save all beings can seem impossibly unrealistic, but this is really what it's getting at. And Sangha again translates it in a way that's eminently accessible and eminently reasonable. He says that what these vows are getting at is this point that I will place no limit on what I am prepared to do for others when the time is ripe and I am ready. I will place no limit on what I am prepared to do for others when the time is ripe and I am ready. That's really what's being got at. And this really is the spirit of the Buddhist Center. It's the spirit of Sangha. So all of the Buddhist Center activities are sort of infused with this spirit. It's really what metta is getting at. Metta is a universal emotion. It places no limit, no exclusion. Everybody is included. This is the spirit of the Buddhist Center. It's what runs through all the activities, all the classes, the work of Sangha action, kind of going out and helping people on the street, the homeless. It's infused with this kind of spirit, this Bodhisattva spirit at our best, at a Buddhist Center at its best. That's what it is trying to be. So very easily we shrink down. We shrink down to looking after our class at the Buddhist Center or our compassionate project. But that's not the spirit of the Buddhist Center. All the events are kind of non-exclusive, kind of trying to reach out. All of Sangha's work is non-exclusive, is trying to reach out to more and more people. But we will feel and see the shrinking of our limitation. I'm just going to look after these people. My GFR group, I'll just look after them. my study group, just us, will kind of, it gets exclusive, doesn't it? That is the inherent tendency of human nature to kind of limitation. But it's not the spirit of Buddhism, and therefore not the spirit of the Buddhist center. But how do we work with this? I'm moving on to my last point here. Oh, I should just say, Sangha said this really quite fascinating point, that the bodhicitta, the awakening mind, is more likely to arise in a collective than when we're in isolation. We might want to discuss that in our groups. So yeah, the last point that I want to talk about is beauty, actually. So the Bodhisattva ideal is an incredibly beautiful ideal, perhaps the most sublime ideal. I think Sangha says this, the most sublime ideal that humanity has ever articulated. This aiming for enlightenment, but for the benefit of all living beings. And the beauty of it is not merely incidental. It's not merely sort of inspiring kind of rhetoric. I've been taking an interest in beauty, something that Sangha kind of talks about in Buddhism. I read a little bit of Kant, and Kant says something very, very interesting about beauty. It's very important to him. He says that the experience of beauty, a sort of moment of beauty, in a moment of beauty, we're taken out of our self-interested point of view to identify with an object for its own sake. That's what's sort of happening in a moment of beauty. We're taken out of ourselves to sort of identify with an object for its own sake, on its own terms. That's what's really happening. And I was very struck by this. In lockdown, I found myself very susceptible to beauty, going out for my walk, and just really uplifted by the beauty of nature, much more so. I couldn't quite understand what was happening. I thought, God, maybe it's the weather. I mean, the weather was beautiful, wasn't it? But I realized as time wore on that it's not that. It's to do with the very particular time that we're in. I myself have felt a keen sense of solidarity, a keener sense of solidarity with more and more beings than I've ever felt in my life. That's kind of linked to this experience of beauty. It's like somehow through identifying, I can literally sort of identify with the millions and millions of beings in the same situation as us, in a way that I've not been able to before. They've been an abstraction, an idea, but I can kind of feel in contact with them. So I'm sort of in that, I am reduced, I'm sort of, I find my place in the world, just one being in this enormous world of millions and millions of people. And far from it being a diminishment, it's uplifting. It's been uplifting. I feel sort of uplifted by that. I feel taken out of myself and can relate to those other beings in their own, for their own sake. Very, very uplifting, very, very inspiring experience, and very beautiful experience of beauty. So this is kind of what the beauty in the Bodhisattva ideal is getting at, that actually beauty can help us with the problem of the sort of vast undertaking of the Bodhisattva ideal, and the fact that it brings us up against our limitations. The problem with that is that we can end up just beating ourselves up. Oh, I should have been better. I should have done this. I should have been nicer, all that sort of stuff. Or just cover it up, cover up our limitations. But we don't want to do either. Well, in beauty, we actually, in an experience of beauty, it actually sort of accepts our limitation in a kind of softening kind of way, but also in the same moment transcends it. And it transcends it by, beauty has a kind of, has a sort of impulse to it, has a charge to it, doesn't it? So we're uplifted and we're drawn beyond ourselves. So beauty can give us the sort of, it provides the impulse to transcendence. So when we're sort of uplifted by the beauty of the Bodhisattva ideal, that's not mere sort of aesthetic indulgence. It's actually the key to sort of moving, to seeing our limitation and transcending it. And this is why within Buddhism, beauty is not merely aesthetic, it's also moral. So the Buddha says, be quick to do what is morally beautiful. And that's what's sort of being got at. That's where the Pali Canon meets in this way the beauty of the Bodhisattva ideal. So beauty, far from being incidental, actually is part of the method, if you like, of transcendence of limitation that takes us out of, allows us to see and let go of our limitation in the right kind of way so that we can transcend it. So that's what the Bodhisattva ideal is inviting us to do. And by God, the world needs it, does it not? So if we can come closer to the Bodhisattva ideal, to the beauty of the Bodhisattva ideal, we can do as the Buddha said, and be quick to do what is morally beautiful. That's what we're being asked to do by in the Bodhisattva ideal. So I think I'll stop there. I hope I've clarified enough kind of what the Bodhisattva ideal is through this perspective of kind of transcendence of limitation, and also why it's so necessary within the good works, very, very easy in our good works to fall down into something more limited. But we need to be lifted up to something less limited, more and more unlimited. And beauty is an intrinsic part to that path. So yeah, I'll just give a bit of time now for just to see if there's any questions bubbling up before we go into breakout groups to discuss this more fully. So it'd be really, really good if there's any questions. It's always helpful, isn't it, when people say what's really on their mind, and then you go, oh yeah, I was thinking that as well. So if you've got any questions, Vidyasaki is going to be our questions moderator. So you can either kind of type them in the chat and she will pick them up that way and pass them to me, or you can just put your hand up and me and Vidyasaki will scan the screen to see any hands up. I think there was a question that came in there, wasn't there, Vidyasaki? Do you want to unmute, Vidyasaki?
Yeah, yeah, there is a question from Claire Taylor-J, actually. She's asking if you could say which text by Sangha Night.
Vidyasaki, I can't hear you for some reason.
Oh, I wonder why that is. Can you hear me now? No.
Vidyasaki, try again. I think I just had the volume down.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, brilliant.
Okay, yeah. So Claire was asking, can you tell us which text by Sangha you've been drawing on for this talk? Oh, and Padmajata's answered that question by saying it's the seminar on the Bodhicharya Avatara. Is that correct?
Actually, well, I have been drawing on the seminar, but also the Bodhisattva ideal itself. Yeah, I've been the collected works, so you probably can't see that very clearly, contains it, the Bodhisattva ideal, but there's actually a separate book, yeah, called the Bodhisattva ideal. It's a really, really brilliant text, actually. Yeah, and I've been drawing from that, as well as Shantideva's Bodhicharya Avatara, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Johanna's got a question as well. Beauty accepts our limitations and draws us beyond them. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah. Yeah, good question. Yeah. So I suppose I'm talking from experience, the experience of beauty. Like that experience I had of solidarity. I mean, I'm talking, that's obviously a sort of ethical state, isn't it? But actually, it was beautiful. I was moved by it. I was moved by an experience of greater solidarity. I was moved by the beauty of it. And in that experience of beauty, it was odd. Uh, I sort of, as I say, I sort of found my place in the world, which is a kind of smaller place in this big universe. So it's in that sense that I sort of realize my limitedness, both in the sense of, I suppose I was taken beyond my habitual way of relating to the world, which is not one of sort of universal solidarity, or not to the same extent. And I could kind of, I could sort of, in somehow that's kind of part of the experience of beauty. It's quite a subtle point in a way. It's one that I'm exploring myself, but just that experience of feeling kind of small but uplifted, if you see what I mean, is part of the experience of beauty. It's got, you could talk of it perhaps in terms of wonder. Wonder, you sort of feel the vastness, don't you? Well, that's there in beauty too. We're somehow aware of our limitedness. So yeah, that's probably as much as I can say about it. Actually, I'd encourage you to sort of explore it. Yeah, I hope that helps.
Yeah,
Thanks. Yeah, there's another question, Arthasiddhi. Artapriya says, do you want to say anything about the role of the order and the Bodhisattva ideal?
Yeah, yeah. The role of the order and the Bodhisattva ideal, yeah. Yeah, so when I was ordained, when anyone was ordained, we recite 4 acceptance verses. With loyalty to my teachers, I accept this ordination. In harmony with friends and companions, I accept this ordination. For the sake of enlightenment, I accept this ordination. And for the benefit of all beings, I accept this ordination. So it's an explicit aspect of becoming an order member. You are committing to this practice of going beyond limitation. You're committing to placing no limit on what you're prepared to do for others when the time is ripe and I am ready. So yeah, the order, we're all committing to that. And then of course, if you get lots of people kind of committing to that, something quite extraordinary can emerge. Bhante Sangha making this point, bodhicitta is more likely to arise in a collective, that the bodhisattva actually is not really intelligible unless we think of it as a collective thing, to use a prosaic word. So really the order is a sort of expression of the bodhisattva. The order at its best is a sort of expression of the bodhisattva reaching out into the world beyond the limitation of each individual in order to reach out to more and more beings. That's what we're trying to do. I hope that was an adequate answer. Artapriya, being the person who ordained me, I hope I've understood.
That's a pretty good answer. I thought you might want to say something about Avalokiteshvara and the order as well, but no, it's a pretty good answer.
Thank you, Artapriya. Are there any more questions? So Avalokiteshvara being the quintessential bodhisattva of compassion. extraordinary image. You can Google it, the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara, extraordinary image of all these 1,000 arms kind of reaching out into the world. An image of the order. Great. So no more questions. All questions answered. Marvelous. Oh, we've got a question coming through there, I think, Bodhisaki.
It's from Sarah. She says, when we witness compassion, it initiates a will for our own arising of compassion. When we witness compassion, it initiates a will for our own arising of compassion.
Yeah. Yeah, I can relate to that, Sarah. Yeah, too. Yeah. And I think that's what I'm getting at with beauty. It's beautiful. It's morally beautiful. Sometimes when I've seen people act, I'm just moved by it. I don't need to have it explained that compassion is a good thing. I see it and I'm moved by it. And that's the sort of, the effect of the beauty, the moral beauty. That's how I've been talking about it. I'm sure you can talk about it in different ways, but the moral beauty moves us. It moves us to act. It lifts us to transcend our limitation and act for the benefit of others. So yeah, I can really relate to that. Yeah, is that how you think of it, Sarah? I can't see you, but you're probably nodding. I'm seeing you nodding. Great. Okay.
There is another question, Arthasiddhi.
Okay, maybe the last question then.
Any suggestions for creating a sense of something beyond our limited self?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Yeah, how do we do that? My goodness. Yeah, I think a way of doing that is other people. Actually, is spiritual community. I think if we can sort of go beyond ourselves, just in that very ordinary way of taking someone else into account, we can start to develop a consciousness that's more responsive to others, less bound and rooted in self-interest. And that sort of consciousness is more sensitive to what lies beyond self. I mean, implicitly, isn't it? It's sensitive to others, but that sensitivity can be pointed, can be sort of honed, tuned up in meditation. Order members have visualization practices, which is a way of turning towards what lies beyond self. So that's a practice that many of us do every day that can help with that. But of course, the Buddha is the central visualization practice. You see what I mean? So just coming into contact with Buddha on the basis of this mind that's more sensitive to and responsive to others, you can start to experience something that is beyond you. You'll probably mix it up with, just inspiration or something like that, but that's fine. We're just trying to sort of, in a way, educate, if that's the right word, clarify, sensitize our discrimination to kind of what lies beyond the shoreline of the island of self. So yeah, that's that's what I'd kind of recommend. There's probably other things. That's just thoughts I find helpful.